Chapter 4. The Entropy Debate Within Humanistic Science. Quote, "From the biblical perspective, the triumph of man under God involves the conquest of time and history, its redemption in terms of covenantal purpose by timetable, schedule, and clock, among many other things. This concept undergirded the exuberant conquest of time and nature by Western man as scientist. The world of the clock, timetable, and schedule was seen as the liberation of man in terms of his purposive mastery of time and nature. But, as scientific man moved steadily from his Christian origin and perspective into a philosophy of process, evolutionism, Gary North, he perversely saw the timetable, clock, and schedule as, first, a means of dehumanizing man as against God's insistence that man is primarily covenant man, and second, as a tyranny to be rebelled against in the name of freedom. Thus, at the moment of science's triumph, science began to be viewed as demonic by its very sons, who sought vain refuge from the clock of history in time lived." End quote. R.J. Rushdoony. Jeremy Rifkin has taken the long-term pessimistic implications of the second law of thermodynamics and has used them to attack the Western concept of short-term progress, especially scientific progress. He is using the ultimate implications of Western science to call into question the benefits of Western technology. He is using the linear time concept involved in entropy, the modern scientific basis of linear time, quote-unquote, time's arrow, Sir Arthur Eddington called it, to destroy Western humanist man's admittedly naive faith in history. He is using Western science to justify the acceptance of Eastern mysticism. He has seen a vulnerable spot in the soft underbelly of self-proclaimed autonomous science, the proclamation of a closed universe that denies God, and he has pierced it. He has understood the implicit pessimism of the entropy concept, and he has used it to attack scientists' more familiar short-run optimism concerning the benefits of modern technology. His work was preceded by about 15 years of propaganda from other social entropists. They rose to prominence during the counterculture movement which began around 1964 or 1965. This anti-technology perspective accelerated almost overnight with the orchestrated appearance of the ecology movement in 1967. As Harvard economist Marshall Goldman remarked in 1967, quote, "Today's news media devote almost as much attention to air and water pollution as to the problems of poverty. Virtually overnight, pollution seems to have become one of America's major issues." End quote. It turned out to be a fad, and half a decade later, ecological concerns had been transmuted politically into a massive federal bureaucracy, the Environmental Protection Agency. Once this bureaucracy was in place, public manifestations of quote-unquote ecology fever subsided. Nevertheless, a breach had appeared in the mindset of Western intellectuals. The technophobia of the intellectuals of the late 1960s has not been completely abandoned. Doubts were raised that have not been laid to rest. Rifkin, in 1980, attempted to construct a new worldview out of the smoldering ashes of these doubts. There have been attempts from the scientific community to refute the world and life view of the social entropists. John Maddox, the editor of the British journal Nature, wrote a book, The Doomsday Syndrome, 1972, which presents the case for the possibility of a series of scientific solutions to problems of pollution, starvation, energy shortages, and other man-made catastrophes. Maddox's book is a defense of controlled science and technology, although Maddox is not clear about just who should do the controlling. Maddox asks, but does not ever really answer, quote, "Why has the environmental movement flourished in the past few years?" End quote. He does not recognize the theological impulses of today's social world. First, there is the Darwinian view of man, which makes man the master of his fate, the only known source of meaning and purpose in the universe. Maddox, as a Darwinian, should understand the religious nature of this impulse, but he doesn't. The defenders of central economic planning, from Karl Marx to Lester Frank Ward, and from Ward to the modern social engineers, have understood Darwin this way. Second, Maddox does not recognize the intellectual impact on the West of an essentially Eastern and mystical view of reality. In short, he does not understand the nature of the theological warfare in the West. 1. Is man responsible? There is always an ambivalence in the minds of humanists concerning the ecological role and responsibility of man. Man is a product of the universe and the laws of evolution, yet he is also apparently sovereign over this process, at least to some degree. He is of the world and in the world, yet he is also in some sense over the world. He is the product of impersonal natural forces, yet through scientific planning he supposedly can become progressively a master of these forces, personalizing an otherwise impersonal universe. The Christian affirms something similar about man's being in the world, but the Christian argues that man is not of this world. His origin ultimately lies outside the creation. Man is of the world in terms of his body, from dust to dust, Genesis 3:19, but this is not the heart and soul of man. God breathed life into him, and he is God's own image. Man knowingly operates under the sovereignty of God, even if he rebelliously suppresses this knowledge, Romans 1:18-22. But the humanist cannot consistently appeal to a creator God in order to undergird his concept of man's sovereignty over nature. So he sometimes sees man's responsibility as quote-unquote living in harmony with nature. Yet sometimes he wants man to be the caretaker over nature who improves upon the operations of nature. Is man in charge? We can see this ambivalence in the thinking of René Dubos, whose book A God Within I cited in the previous chapter. Dubos has been one of the important intellectual leaders of the ecology movement since the 1960s. He has expressed humanism's dualism between man and nature very well. In an interview in the popular news magazine U.S. News and World Report, February 23, 1981, he stated the case for quote-unquote man over nature. Quote, "Humans can improve on nature. We can transform the earth and bring to light potentialities of nature that are not expressed in the state of wilderness. Does this mean that we should exploit the environment? Not at all. But we should not be overwhelmed by it either. We really have to rethink what it is we like about nature. Certainly, we must maintain as much wilderness as possible in the Rockies and Sierras, the Adirondacks, and in a few other parts of the country where it still exists. But I think that in general, people think of nature not as wilderness, but as something adapted to them on a human scale that they can appreciate with the totality of their being. They like to be able to feel that they can walk through it rather than be overwhelmed by it." End quote. Is man really destroying the environment? No, says Dubos. Quote, "Nature is very resilient, and so I am optimistic about the ability of the environment to recover from the damage people inflict on it. There is a phenomenal resiliency in the mechanisms of the earth. So man ultimately can be in harmony with the earth. When we deal gently with the earth, even when we have thoughtlessly damaged it, we can repair our friendship with it." End quote. He sounds a lot like Maddox. Quote, "In the case of both nature and human beings, we can improve them by developing their potentialities and taking advantage of their resiliency, but there is a point beyond which such activities can become dangerous." End quote. What we need is for science to anticipate the dangers of any given process or development, precisely what Maddox recommends. Neither of them spells out how this might be accomplished by scientists, yet Dubos is one of the scientists who was criticized by Maddox in his book. The debate among scientists over ecology has been conducted within the framework of Darwinism and has therefore been caught in the Darwinian dualism between man, the product of purposeless evolution, and man, the purposeful master of evolution. Confusion only increased when proponents of another religious perspective entered the debate on the side of ecology and environmentalism, namely mystics who see no hope in the humanist rhetoric of progress, science, and economic growth. Accompanying these Eastern mystics were representatives of Christian pietism, who also see no long-term hope in the rhetoric of earthly progress. Having no hope in the future, they reject science and technology as valid means of bringing long-term improvement to society or nature. It is this perspective which baffles Maddox, yet as a Darwinian he is caught in entropy's logical trap. His universe is running down, just as Rifkin's is. The only question is the time frame in which the entropy process is socially significant. Ignoring the long run. As an evolutionary scientist, Maddox is aware of entropy, but he also knows that it is an exceedingly long-range problem. Quote, "In the long run, as Lord Keynes put it, we shall all be dead. The catalogue of natural disasters includes equally unpredictable natural phenomena, which will eventually be more damaging. The ultimate disaster, remote though it may be, will come within the transformation due eventually to take place in the Sun." End quote. The Sun will become exhausted and expand up to 100 million miles in diameter. The Earth is 93 million miles away from today's Sun. But this event is quote-unquote certain to be 1,000 million years in the future. Quote, "These are horrendous prospects, but they provide a kind of yardstick with which to assess the durability of spaceship Earth. On this scale, the self-destructive potential of terrestrial technology will be puny for a long time to come. The analogy of the spaceship is false simply because the scale of the Earth is so different from that of any spaceship that could be constructed artificially." End quote. The response of the believer in conventional science and technology is straightforward. The human race has plenty of time remaining. Even though humans are increasing the dissipation of the universe's energy and order, the universe is very, very large. It can sustain the loss. Maddox accepts the overall worldview of the entropists, but he is not overwhelmed by it. Mankind will be long gone by the time the last star flickers out. Though the world is running down, our puny efforts in dissipating the universe's order will hardly be noticed, especially since man is the only known species in the universe who might notice. The Darwinian evolutionists proclaim a doctrine of entropy which allows for the development of zones of order that reverse the quote-unquote entropy process regionally. They want an open box for mankind and his environment, at least for a few billion more years or so. How big a closed box? On this point, the Darwinian and the social entropists disagree. The social entropist agrees with the scientific creationists and disagrees with conventional Darwinists on this one issue. The Earth is an, quote, entropically closed box, end quote. Rifkin emphasizes this point. Quote, "The Earth is a closed system in relation to the universe. Our planet remains a closed subsystem of the universe. The point is, the Sun by itself does not generate life. You can let the Sun flow into an empty glass jar from now until the final heat death of the solar system, and still no life will come forth. For life to unfold, the Sun must interact with the closed system of matter, minerals, and metals on the planet Earth, converting these materials to life and the utilities of life. This interaction facilitates the dissipation of this fixed endowment of terrestrial matter that makes up the Earth's crust." End quote. Thus, there is no universe-wide storehouse of unused and usable energy to extend the lifespan of the Earth. The social entropist wants Western man to deal institutionally with this entropy factor immediately, for time is truly running out. The smaller the quote-unquote closed box, the more rapidly entropy disrupts the environment. The social entropist's argument is simple. We live on a tiny ball. The Earth is not an open box. Yes, it was an open box when life first appeared. The Sun's energy did create life, not a creator God. The Earth was sufficiently open to get God out of the picture as a necessary explanation. But now we are trapped on Earth, and we are running out of resources. We do not have much time remaining to us. We must act fast, preferably before the end of the 20th century. The fact that the Sun probably will not run down for several billion years is irrelevant to Rifkin. So, for that matter, is science. Rifkin is not arguing about science, which is why Maddox has such trouble dealing scientifically with people who possess Rifkin's outlook. They use the language of science as an ideological weapon against those who have only a smattering of scientific knowledge. The meaning of life. Maddox does not understand the motivation behind, quote, the doomsday syndrome, end quote. He looks at the issues from the point of view of science, of Newtonian cause and effect. Why all the fuss about pollution, catastrophes, and running out of resources? If man has time, capital, ingenuity, and scientific techniques at his disposal, most of these problems can be solved at some price. We can debate about the price, of course, for there will always be trade-offs in life, but why throw up our hands in despair, as if men were incapable of discovering acceptable solutions to these problems? Maddox looks to the success we have had as a species in using science to come up with solutions over the past 2 centuries, and he appeals to reason. We can do it over the next 2 centuries if we have faith, intelligence, and capital investment. But his arguments do not convince the doomsday prophets. Why not? Because Maddox misses the point. The debate is really about the meaning of life, not the time framework of the entropy process. It is an eschatological debate, not scientific. Entropy versus meaning. What is the proper biblical analysis of this family quarrel between the 2 factions of entropists? To answer this, we must understand entropy. If entropy is a universal law, then it will inescapably swallow up the works of man. If man is bounded by history rather than the creator, if our universe is a closed box ethically, historically, and cosmically, then man's works have no ultimate meaning or significance. But this means that mankind has no ultimate meaning or significance. What does the amount of time remaining matter? A century, a millennium, or 10,000 millennia? If entropy is God, then mankind eventually becomes a sacrificial victim to that God. I cited in Chapter 2 the pessimistic conclusions of British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, who faced up to the implications of the heat death of the universe. He wrote, quote, "All the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius, are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and that the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built." End quote. The proponents of zero economic growth are simply trying to adapt today's way of thought and life to what science assumes will probably be incomparably long-term implications of the entropy process. They are doing this as a religious commitment. They refuse to allow themselves to be deluded by the illusion of meaning provided by an inevitably short-run period of economic growth, say a few million years. Growth is a product of future orientation. The debate over the legitimacy or desirability of growth, any kind of growth, is necessarily a debate about mankind's legitimate orientation toward the future. If mankind has no ultimate earthly future, which is what scientists, philosophers, speculators have argued, whether Darwinists or Eastern mystics, then what is our proper response as a species? Both sides of this humanist debate call on mankind to keep a stiff upper lip and persevere as best we can. The Darwinian entropists add that while we are at it, let us continue to eat, drink, and be merry, at a compound growth rate of 6% per annum, if we can, for eventually the human species dies. The social entropists reply that this would produce a fool's paradise, that man must find inner meaning or union with the dying cosmos, or metaphysical union with an impersonal God who will somehow survive entropy. They want to restructure man's immediate institutions, thought patterns, and reproduction rate in order to acknowledge ritually the trillion-year meaning of entropy. Theirs is a religious commitment. They believe that the works of man's hands, of all men's hands, should testify immediately to the cosmic reality of entropy, even if mankind might conceivably eke out another century or 2 of growth through improved technology and capital accumulation. The fact that the Earth could easily have 10 million centuries ahead does not impress the social entropists. 2. Entropy and guilt. Rifkin's book is a call to the West to experience a religious conversion. He wants all men, but especially residents of the industrial West who rely on the West's energy-dissipating technology, to stop aiding and abetting the entropy process. We must stop using so much energy. Quote, "Addiction! There is simply no other way to accurately describe America's energy habit." End quote. In other words, he wants us to take steps to avoid guilt in what must be regarded as man's cosmic rebellion against nature. The social entropists are unconcerned about man's ethical rebellion against the Creator. They worry about Western man's supposed rebellion against the very mode of being of the creation, including man himself. which they believe is an entropy-bound evolutionary process. In short, they worship the creation rather than the creator. Romans 1:18-22. These are guilt-ridden men, or at least they are politicians who are trying to make guilt-ridden people out of their readers. They are residents of the industrial and originally Christian West, and they see themselves as accomplices in a kind of gang rape of the cosmos, or at least of the, quote, fragile, defenseless, end quote, earth. They are seeking religious atonement by crying out against the supposed metaphysical sin of the West, which ultimately is the sin of life itself. All living beings are an affront to entropy. Life dissipates the energy and order of the cosmos, speeding up the entropy process by at least a few milliseconds or picosecond in a 100 or 500 billion year process of the universe. What a sin! We must atone! Life must therefore be limited. The question is, whose life? Life and death. Rifkin is caught in a theological dilemma. He worships all life as a good Eastern mystic always does, yet he also believes that the entropy process must be honored. On the one hand, he writes, quote, every species must be preserved, simply because it has an inherent and inalienable right to life by virtue of its existence, end quote. On the other hand, he writes, quote, even the tiniest plant maintains its own order at the expense of creating greater disorder in the overall environment, end quote. But if life inescapably dissipates energy, how can man live and also avoid rebellion against other living beings in nature? How can he sustain his life or the life of any of his chosen species, thereby increasing the burden sustained by his environment and still avoid guilt? If life must be honored, then which form of life? If plant or animal life interferes with man's life, who decides which life is to be sacrificed? These may sound like preposterous questions. Nevertheless, they are valid Christian responses to a preposterous worldview. Men, quote-unquote, owe no allegiance to an impersonal, murderous process of nature called entropy. Death is the last enemy to be overcome by Christ at the day of resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15:26. We labor against death and sickness, for death is an enemy to be overcome progressively. Ethical conformity to God's law brings us a progressive victory over sources of death. The scientists in England who have the last remaining smallpox germs in their laboratory should take the final step to wipe out smallpox, for the germs are agents of death. To keep them alive, quote, for the sake of further scientific experimentation, end quote, is not sensible. This scourge can be wiped from the face of the earth in an afternoon. Life accelerates entropy. If the West's production system were destroyed, and its, quote, energy-dissipating processes, end quote, swept from history, the social entropists would rejoice, though not in mass-produced paperback books, at least until they began starving, as they almost certainly would, along with a few 100 million of their neighbors. Logically, they would have to see mass starvation as a benefit for the environment. Rival species could survive for an extra few hundred or few thousand years, but if the sin of man is his sin against the environment, then why not go all the way and call for the death of man? Why not go even further and call for the destruction of all life? If the quote-unquote energy addiction of the West is evil, then all man-made dissipation of energy is evil. If man-made energy dissipation is evil, then all living creatures are inherently guilty of this sin. Life itself is a form of quote-unquote energy addiction. It is only a matter of degree, species by species. Rifkin attacks technology as life-destroying and exploitative. Quote, technologies by their very nature are expropriating. They extract, they distill, they process, they organize, they convert, they consume, they regiment. End quote. This sounds evil, but then he softens the blow. Quote, there is an acknowledgement that some form of expropriation is always necessary. All things desire to live, and it is a law of nature that for something to live, something else must die. End quote. This creates an ethical dilemma, the kind of ethical dilemma that the pantheist physician Albert Schweitzer faced. How can we affirm life if all life survives by imposing death? Can we set forth guidelines of ethical living in such a universe? Rifkin does not even try. He hides behind the vague, undefined words, too much. Quote, but it is also true that too much expropriation can result in destroying the very life support systems we rely on for our future survival. End quote. Whose life support systems? Ours. Who must survive? We must. We are back to the original presupposition of all humanism. Man must prevail. The consistent entropist should call for an end to all life. Only inconsistency prevents this. But if the social entropist is unwilling to be consistent and call a halt to the energy drain associated with all living things, then why should he expect residents of the West to pay any attention to him and cut back on their lifestyles? After all, it is only a matter of degree, of comparative rates of energy addiction. The lifestyle of the urban Westerner is only relatively more guilty before the god of entropy than the lifestyle of the savage, or for that matter, of the amoeba. The philosophy of social entropy is innately a philosophy of death, despite the fact that it officially affirms all life. It worships a physical, quote-unquote, law of entropy as its governing uniformitarian principle. It worships an impersonal god of destruction, but this is equally true of scientific Darwinian entropy. Its uniformitarian principle is also an impersonal consuming god. God is correct. All those who hate me love death. Proverbs 8:36b. Conclusion. John Maddox has come face to face with a religious impulse that he does not understand. It makes no sense to him. His old-fashioned secular humanism blinds him to the reasons for the intellectual power and appeal of a rival form of humanism. He is dealing with people who virtually worship entropy the way that savages worship a god of death. They want to sacrifice human progress on entropy's altar in order to avoid a direct confrontation with the entropy process. They want to placate entropy, as savages want to placate their god of death. They want a peace treaty with entropy. Maddox wants mankind to fight against unconquerable entropy until the very end. Maddox wants temporary dominion. Rifkin wants a stalemate, so that he can escape into quote-unquote higher consciousness. In mankind's Darwinian war against entropy, Rifkin is a quisling, Maddox is a kamikaze. In summary, 1. Humanists are at war with time. 2. Rifkin uses the second law of thermodynamics to call into question all progress. 3. Rifkin therefore uses science to challenge science. 4. He is promoting Eastern mysticism by means of Western science. 5. The counterculture of the late 1960s was also anti-technological. 6. Confidence in science began to wane within certain intellectual circles. 7. John Maddox tried to refute these pessimists in 1972. 8. He did not understand the deeply religious commitment of his opponents. 9. The humanist cannot explain man. 10. Is man responsible? To whom or what? 11. Is man over nature, even though he is supposedly the product of purposeless nature? 12. Is man the cosmic destroyer? 13. Is man the source of healing? 14. Eastern mystics and Christian pietists reject the idea of man as a healer, whose job is to exercise dominion over nature. 15. Maddox's universe is doomed. It is only a question of time. 16. Maddox ignores the long-run consequences of entropy. 17. His opponents are guided by the long run, despite any short-run gains. 18. He does not understand their religion-based outlook. 19. Rifkin and his followers are pessimists about the short run because they are blinded by the pessimism of the long run. 20. The debate is over the meaning of life, not pollution. 21. Rifkin uses entropy to create a sense of guilt. 22. He worries about man's technological revolt against nature, not man's ethical revolt against God. 23. For Rifkin, all life is an affront to the universe, for life accelerates entropy. 24. Rifkin's is a philosophy of death. 25. Maddox, as a Darwinian, is unable to deal with the underlying religious issues.